Sarah's hands moved through the routine without thought. Pin the hair. Smooth the collar. Adjust the lace at the sleeve. Mrs. Harrison sat before the mirror in her dressing room, examining her reflection with the intensity of a jeweler inspecting a diamond for flaws. The morning sun cut through the windows, illuminating particles of dust that Sarah had failed to wipe away the day before. She made a mental note to clean them again tonight, after Mrs. Harrison went to bed. "The ball must be perfect," Mrs. Harrison said, not looking at Sarah but at her own reflection. "The governor himself will attend. Do you understand what that means?" "Yes, ma'am. It means everything must be flawless. The food, the music, the decorations, the servants." She turned suddenly, her eyes fixing on Sarah. "Especially the servants. One mistake, Sarah, and there will be consequences." "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Harrison turned back to the mirror, satisfied. Sarah continued pinning her hair, each movement precise. She had been doing this since she was 16, 12 years of mornings just like this one. Her fingers knew every curl, every preferred style, every mood that dictated how Mrs. Harrison wanted to present herself to the world. The Harrison plantation sat 3 miles outside Charleston, close enough to the city for Senator Harrison to conduct business, but far enough to maintain the illusion of pastoral elegance. The main house was white-columned and imposing, surrounded by gardens that required 4 full-time gardeners to maintain. Beyond the manicured lawns stretched the working plantation. Tobacco fields, cotton fields, the slave quarters, the overseer's house, the stables, the barn. 60 enslaved people worked the fields. 8 worked in the house. Sarah lived in a small room off the kitchen, barely large enough for a narrow bed and a trunk for her 2 dresses. It was a privilege, she had been told many times. Field hands slept in crowded cabins, 6 or 8 to a room. House servants had individual spaces. Small mercies in a system without mercy. She had been born on this plantation 28 years ago. Her mother, Grace, had worked in the kitchen until Sarah was 12. That was the year Senator Harrison needed cash to invest in a shipping venture. Grace was sold to a plantation in Georgia. Sarah remembered the morning they took her, her mother's hands gripping hers, the overseer pulling them apart, the wagon disappearing down the road. Grace had been trying to say something, but the words were lost in the sound of Sarah's own screaming. After that, Sarah learned to be quiet. She learned to make her face blank, her body still, her presence invisible. Bessie, the cook, took her under her care and taught her the skills that would keep her in the house rather than the fields. How to press clothes without scorching them. How to serve without being seen. How to read a white person's mood from the set of their shoulders. The scar on her left shoulder came from a lesson in obedience when she was 15. She had broken a teacup, an accident, her hands slippery from washing dishes. Mrs. Harrison had pressed the flat of a hot iron against her skin for 3 seconds. The message was clear. Carelessness had consequences. Sarah still felt the phantom heat sometimes when she was nervous. She had been close to another house girl once. Patience. They had been the same age, had whispered together in the dark about impossible things like freedom, like families that stayed together, like futures that belonged to them. Then Patience became pregnant by the senator's nephew during one of his visits. 6 months later, she was sold to a plantation in Mississippi. No one spoke her name after that. Sarah stopped whispering about impossible things. She stopped imagining futures. She simply moved through each day, invisible and efficient, surviving. The household operated with rigid hierarchy. Senator Harrison was rarely present, spending most of the year in Washington. Mrs. Amelia Harrison ruled the domestic sphere with obsessive attention to detail and a quick temper. She was 34, childless despite 10 years of marriage, and channeled her energies into maintaining the plantation's social standing. Thomas, the butler, was an older man who had served the Harrison family for 30 years. He had been beaten severely as a young man for attempting to learn to read. The beating left him with a permanent limp and an absolute loyalty born of fear. He enforced discipline among the house servants with the zeal of a convert, reporting any hint of disobedience to Mrs. Harrison or the overseers. Bessie had worked in the kitchen for 2 decades. She was 53, though she looked older. Her mother had been African-born and had taught her traditional knowledge of herbs and plants. Bessie could cure illnesses, ease pain, help women through difficult births. She could also, though she never spoke of it openly, do other things with plants. Things that harmed rather than healed. Garrett, the head overseer, managed the field operations and enforced discipline with systematic brutality. He was a white man from Virginia, hired 5 years ago for his reputation for efficiency. He carried a whip and used it regularly. He also carried a pistol. The enslaved population feared him more than they feared Senator Harrison, who rarely involved himself in the daily violence required to keep 60 people working without pay. Sarah's younger brother Daniel worked in the stables. He was 16, tall and strong, with their mother's eyes and a dangerous streak of hope. He talked sometimes about the North, about freedom, about escape. Sarah always shut down these conversations quickly. Hope was dangerous. Hope got people killed. 3 weeks before the ball, Mrs. Harrison received confirmation that Governor Hamilton would attend. Her reaction was immediate and intense. Every room in the house was to be deep cleaned, every piece of silver polished, every curtain washed. The gardens were to be perfected. The menu was planned and replanned daily. The work hours for house servants stretched from before dawn to well past midnight. Lucy, one of the younger house girls, fainted from exhaustion while scrubbing floors. Mrs. Harrison had her sent to work in the fields as punishment for weakness. The message was clear to everyone. The ball was more important than their health, their exhaustion, their humanity. Sarah moved through the increased demands mechanically. She was accustomed to exhaustion. What she was not accustomed to was the conversation she overheard one afternoon, 10 days before the ball. Mrs. Harrison was in the parlor with her younger sister, Caroline, who had come from Charleston to help with preparations. Sarah was in the adjacent room, mending curtains. They didn't know she could hear them. "I still think you should sell some of the field hands instead," Caroline was saying. "They're worth more." "The field hands are necessary for production," Mrs. Harrison replied. "The stable boy is expendable. We can get another." "I suppose you're right. How much will you get for him?" $800. "Mr. Peterson from Mississippi needs workers. He'll take Daniel off our hands 2 days after the ball." Sarah's needle stopped mid-stitch. "Does the boy know?" Caroline asked. "Of course not. James will tell him the morning of. Less fuss that way." "And his sister?" "The one who works in the house." "Sarah? She'll be upset, naturally, but she's well-trained. She won't make trouble." Mrs. Harrison laughed, a light social laugh. "Besides, it's not as if they're real siblings in any meaningful sense. They barely see each other. Still, $800 just to cover James's gambling debts seems excessive. My husband's recreational activities are his own concern. The boy needs to be sold, and that's the end of it. He's just a stable boy. We can get another." Sarah sat frozen, the curtain bunched in her lap. Daniel, her only family, the only person left in the world who remembered their mother, who shared her blood, who made surviving feel less impossible. $800. Less than the cost of the chandelier in the ballroom. She forced herself to continue sewing. Her face remained calm. Years of practice had taught her how to keep breathing when everything inside her screamed. That night, alone in her small room, Sarah did not cry. She lay on her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling. Her mind, usually carefully blank, began to work in ways it never had before. Daniel didn't know yet. He was working in the stables, probably brushing down the senator's horses, maybe dreaming his dangerous dreams about the North. 2 days after the ball, he would be put on a wagon and sent to Mississippi. The Peterson plantation was known even here for its brutality. Life expectancy for workers there was notoriously short. Sarah could tell him, warn him, but what then? If he ran, they would catch him. Dogs, patrollers, guns. The punishment for running was worse than the punishment for staying. They would whip him publicly, maybe sell him anyway to an even worse place. Maybe kill him as an example. She could beg Mrs. Harrison to reconsider. She almost laughed at the thought. Beg the woman who had sold her mother, who had sold patience, who sold human beings as casually as ordering new curtains. She could do nothing. Accept it. Survive it. That was what she had always done. Survival was the only victory available to her. Or, the thought came quietly, almost gently, or she could make them pay. Sarah sat up in bed. Her heart was beating fast, but her mind felt strangely clear. She thought about Mrs. Harrison's routine. The woman drank wine every evening. She took her meals alone when the senator was away. She trusted Sarah to prepare her bath, pour her drinks, handle her food. She thought about Bessie's herb garden. The plants the old woman grew for medicine and for other purposes. Foxglove for heart conditions. Belladonna for pain. Other plants, other uses. She thought about the ball. All those guests, all that chaos. An elderly woman overcome by heat and excitement. A tragic death. Who would suspect the quiet, obedient house servant? The thought should have horrified her. Instead, it filled her with something she hadn't felt in years. A sense of possibility. A sense of control. Sarah lay back down. She did not sleep. She planned. Over the next 3 days, she began to pay attention to things she had never noticed before. Where the rat poison was kept in the cellar. The arsenic powder in the senator's study used for preserving his taxidermy collection. The locked cabinet in the doctor's office where laudanum and other medicines were stored. She watched Bessie work in the kitchen, sorting herbs and preparing remedies for various ailments among the enslaved population. Bessie knew plants the way other people knew Bible verses. Sarah needed that knowledge. On the 4th day, she helped Bessie sort dried herbs in the kitchen. It was late evening, most of the other servants already asleep. "Bessie," Sarah said carefully, "what's this one?" She held up a cluster of dried purple flowers. "Foxglove," Bessie said without looking up. "Good for heart troubles. Slows the heartbeat. What if someone takes too much?" Bessie's hands paused for a moment, then continued sorting. "Slows it too much. Heart stops. Looks like natural causes most times." Sarah said nothing, just nodded and continued sorting. Bessie glanced at her. "Why you asking?" "Just curious. You know so much about healing. I want to learn." "Healing and harming use the same plants," Bessie said quietly. "Just different amounts. And different intentions." Their eyes met. Something unspoken passed between them. "You got a headache?" Bessie asked. "You look troubled." "Yes," Sarah said. "I have a headache." Bessie handed her a different herb. "Make tea from this. Willow bark. It'll help with pain." She paused. "Real pain, anyway." Sarah took the willow bark and thanked her. She did not make tea, but now she knew what she needed to know. The next morning, Thomas the butler approached her while she was polishing silver in the dining room. "Mrs. Harrison says you've been asking questions about herbs and remedies," he said, his voice low and suspicious. "Says it's unusual for you." Sarah kept polishing, her movements steady. I get headaches sometimes. I asked Bessie what might help. That's all. You sure about that? Yes, sir. Thomas watched her for a long moment. Mrs. Harrison's got her eye on you. Says you've been acting strange. You remember what happened to Lucy? Yes, sir. Sent to the fields. That's right. So you be careful. Any trouble during this ball and you'll answer for it first. I understand, sir. Thomas limped away, his cane tapping on the wooden floor. Sarah continued polishing silver, her reflection distorted and strange in the curved surface of a serving platter. That afternoon, while Mrs. Harrison was away visiting a neighbor, Sarah entered the senator's study. She had legitimate reason to be there. She cleaned the room twice a week. But this time, she looked carefully at the small cabinet where the senator kept supplies for his taxidermy hobby. The arsenic powder was there, clearly labeled, sitting next to turpentine and other chemicals. She did not take any, not yet, but she noted its location, its appearance, how much was there. She also found, while dusting the senator's desk, a document partially hidden under other papers. A bill of sale. Daniel's name was written at the top. Price, $800. Buyer, Charles Peterson, Peterson Plantation, Mississippi. Delivery date, 2 days after the ball. Sarah carefully replaced the document exactly as she had found it. She finished cleaning the study and left. That evening, she found Daniel in the stables. He was brushing down one of the senator's horses, humming softly to himself. When he saw her, he smiled. He had their mother's smile. Sarah, what brings you out here? She looked at him for a long moment, memorizing his face. I wanted to see you. Something wrong. Everything was wrong. Their mother was gone. Patience was gone. Soon he would be gone. And there was nothing she could do about it except watch it happen again and again until she herself was sold or died or became too broken to remember why any of it mattered. No, she said. Nothing's wrong. He didn't believe her. She could see it in his eyes, but he didn't push. They stood together in the stable, not speaking, just being near each other. The horse snorted softly. Somewhere outside, a whippoorwill called. Sarah, Daniel said quietly, sometimes I think about running. Don't. Just sometimes. I think about it. About the North. About. Don't, she said more firmly. Don't even think it. You know what they do to runners. I know. But sometimes I think maybe it's worth it. Maybe dying free is better than living like this. She wanted to tell him he wouldn't have to run, that she would handle it, that she would make sure he stayed. But she couldn't. Not yet. Instead, she just squeezed his hand and left. 6 days before the ball, the pace of preparation became frantic. The house was in constant motion. Furniture was rearranged daily. Mrs. Harrison changed her mind about the menu 4 times. 2 more servants were brought in from a neighboring plantation to help with the increased workload. Sarah moved through it all in a state of focused calm. She had made her decision. Now she just needed to wait for the right moment. 5 days before the ball, Garrett the overseer visited the kitchen during dinner preparation. He stood in the doorway, whip coiled at his belt, and addressed all the servants present. Any of you caused trouble during the governor's visit, he said. Any mistake, any problem, and you'll answer to me. Public whipping for the first offense. Sold south for the second. Understood. A chorus of yes, sir followed. Garrett's eyes lingered on Sarah. That means you too, girl. I know you're supposed to be the good one, but I'm watching. Yes, sir, Sarah said, her voice perfectly neutral. After he left, the kitchen was silent except for the sound of Bessie's knife chopping vegetables. The rhythm was steady, hypnotic, like a heartbeat. For days before the ball, Mrs. Harrison tried on her gown for the final fitting. Sarah stood behind her, adjusting the hem. The dress was emerald green silk, imported from France, worth more than Sarah's entire life. "Perfect," Mrs. Harrison said, admiring herself in the mirror. "This will be the finest ball Charleston has seen in years. Everything is falling into place." She turned slightly, examining the dress from another angle. "Oh, I nearly forgot to mention we're selling Daniel, the stable boy. Your brother, I believe." Sarah's hands stilled on the hem. "Don't worry," Mrs. Harrison continued, still looking at her reflection. "He's going to a good plantation in Mississippi. Mr. Peterson needs workers and is paying well. It's good business." She adjusted her necklace. "I do hope the buyer treats him well, though I suppose it doesn't really matter, does it? He'll adjust." Sarah resumed pinning the hem. Her hands were steady. Her face was blank. But inside, something fundamental shifted. Mrs. Harrison looked down at her. "You understand this is necessary, don't you? The senator has expenses. These things happen." "Yes, ma'am," Sarah said. "Good. I knew you'd understand. You've always been sensible." She turned back to the mirror. "Now make sure this hem is perfect. The governor will notice every detail." Sarah finished the pinning in silence. As she worked, a single thought repeated in her mind with absolute clarity. She has to die. It was no longer a question of whether. It was only a question of how. That night, Sarah sat in her room with a choice before her. She could continue as she had always been, obedient, invisible, surviving. She could watch Daniel be sold and carry on, as she had carried on after her mother was sold, after Patience was sold, after every loss and humiliation and casual cruelty. Or she could act. The consequences were clear. If she was caught, when she was caught, she would be killed. Hanged, most likely. Made an example of. And not just her. Others might be punished too. Collective punishment was the system's favorite tool. But Daniel would be saved. The sale would be disrupted. And Mrs. Harrison, who sold people like livestock, who destroyed families with casual indifference, who treated human beings as inconvenient expenses, she would be dead. Sarah thought about her mother, torn away screaming. She thought about Patience, sold pregnant. She thought about Lucy, sent to the fields for fainting from exhaustion. She thought about every day of her 28 years, every moment of forced submission, every swallowed word, every silent scream. She thought about Daniel's smile, the last piece of her family. Her decision crystallized with perfect clarity. If she did nothing, she would die anyway. Slowly, over years, piece by piece, until nothing remained of who she might have been. This way, at least, she would die having chosen something, having done something, having mattered, even if only for a moment. Sarah lay down on her narrow bed. For the first time in years, she felt something close to peace. She had a purpose. She had a plan. 3 days before the ball, she would begin. The morning sun cut across the kitchen as Sarah helped Bessie prepare breakfast for the main house. The routine was familiar: eggs, toast, jam, coffee. Mrs. Harrison took her breakfast in the small dining room at precisely 8 o'clock. The senator, when he was home, preferred his an hour earlier. This morning he was still in Washington, not due back until the day before the ball. Sarah cracked eggs into a bowl while Bessie tended the stove. The kitchen was warm, already heating up despite the early hour. Through the window, she could see field hands moving toward the tobacco rows in the gray dawn light. "You been quiet," Bessie said, not looking up from the pan. "I'm always quiet. Different kind of quiet." Sarah said nothing. She whisked the eggs and poured them into the pan Bessie had prepared. 3 days, Bessie said after a moment. 3 days till the ball. Yes. Mrs. Harrison getting more particular by the hour. Heard she made Lucy cry yesterday over a wrinkled tablecloth. Lucy's young. She'll learn. Bessie turned to look at her directly. Sarah, you need something from me, you can ask. The words hung in the air between them. Sarah met Bessie's eyes and saw understanding there. The old woman knew. Perhaps she had known from the moment Sarah started asking about herbs. I don't know what you mean, Sarah said carefully. Bessie nodded slowly and turned back to the stove. All right then, but my offer stands. They finished preparing breakfast in silence. Sarah carried the tray to the dining room, where Mrs. Harrison was already seated, reading a letter from her sister in Charleston. The governor's wife is bringing 6 people in her party, Mrs. Harrison said without looking up. That changes the seating arrangement. We'll need to adjust the place cards. Yes, ma'am. And Sarah, I've been thinking about the wine service. You'll be responsible for my personal glasses throughout the evening. I don't want just anyone handling my drinks. Sarah's pulse quickened, though her face remained blank. Yes, ma'am. Good. Now, about your brother. Has anyone told him yet about the sale? I don't believe so, ma'am. Good. James will handle it the morning after the ball. Less time for fuss. She took a sip of coffee. You're not to speak to him about it. Is that understood? Yes, ma'am. I'm trusting you on this, Sarah. You've always been reliable. Don't disappoint me now. No, ma'am. Mrs. Harrison finally looked up from her letter. Her eyes studied Sarah's face for a moment, searching for something. Whatever she was looking for, she didn't find it. Sarah's expression gave nothing away. You may go, Mrs. Harrison said, returning to her letter. Sarah left the dining room and returned to the kitchen. Her hands were steady as she washed the breakfast dishes, but her mind was racing. Mrs. Harrison wanted her to personally handle the wine service. The universe, it seemed, was offering opportunities. That afternoon, while Mrs. Harrison was occupied with decorators in the ballroom, Sarah found a moment alone in the kitchen with Bessie. The old woman was grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle, the rhythmic scraping the only sound. Bessie, Sarah said quietly, I need to learn about foxglove. Bessie's hands paused, then resumed their grinding. Foxglove's a dangerous plant. I know. Used for heart troubles. Slows an irregular heartbeat. Makes it steady. And too much. Bessie set down the pestle and wiped her hands on her apron. She walked to the window and looked out at the yard, where Thomas was supervising 2 servants hanging lanterns for the ball. Too much makes the heart too slow. Then it stops. She turned back to Sarah. Tastes bitter. Mix it with something strong flavored. Red wine works best. How much would be too much? Bessie was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. I ain't saying I'm giving you anything. I ain't saying I know what you're planning. But if someone were to use foxglove for harm, they'd need enough to be certain. Maybe 15 dried flowers, ground to powder, mixed well into at least 1 full glass of wine. And the symptoms? Starts with nausea, confusion, then the heart problems. Could take an hour, could take less. Looks like heart failure. Doctors can't tell the difference most times. Sarah nodded slowly. Thank you. I didn't tell you nothing, Bessie said firmly. You understand? I didn't tell you nothing. I understand. Bessie returned to her grinding. Your mama would be proud of you, she said softly, and terrified, both at once. Sarah left the kitchen before she could respond. Her throat was tight, her eyes burning. She couldn't afford tears. Not now. That evening, Thomas caught her in the hallway outside Mrs. Harrison's bedroom. Mrs. Harrison says you've been acting peculiar, he said, blocking her path. I haven't been acting any way, sir. That's what worries her. Says you too calm with your brother about to be sold. Says it ain't natural. Sarah kept her expression neutral. I'm upset, sir. I just don't show it. I learned not to show things. Thomas studied her face. You better not be planning nothing. You know what happened to that boy Marcus? The one who tried to run last year. Yes, sir. I saw the whipping. 20 lashes. Lost so much blood. Thought he'd die. And he's still here, still working. That's what happens to troublemakers. He leaned closer. You understand me? Yes, sir. Mrs. Harrison got her eye on you. I got my eye on you. Garrett got his eye on you. You make one wrong move during this ball, and you won't just be sent to the fields. You'll be sold so far south, you'll never see daylight again. I understand, sir. Thomas limped away, his cane tapping ominously on the wooden floor. Sarah stood alone in the hallway, her heart pounding but her face still calm. The trap was tightening. They suspected something even if they didn't know what. She would have to be even more careful. 2 days before the ball, Mrs. Harrison gathered all the house servants in the main hallway. 8 people stood in a line. Sarah, Thomas, Bessie, Lucy, 2 other house girls named Martha and Ruth, and 2 men brought in from a neighboring plantation to help with heavy work. This ball will define this household's reputation, Mrs. Harrison announced, pacing before them like a general reviewing troops. The governor will be watching. Charleston society will be watching. There will be no mistakes. She stopped in front of Lucy, who was barely 17. None. Lucy kept her eyes down, trembling slightly. Mrs. Harrison continued down the line. Sarah, you'll manage my personal service. Thomas, you'll oversee the serving staff. Bessie, the kitchen is your domain. I expect perfection. The rest of you will take instructions from Thomas throughout the evening. She paused in front of Sarah. You've been with me a long time. I'm trusting you more than anyone else tomorrow night. Don't let me down. No, ma'am, Sarah said. After Mrs. Harrison dismissed them, Sarah caught Martha's eye. The 2 women had worked together for years, though they were never close. Martha was 35, with 3 children in the quarters, all fathered by white men who had since moved away or married white women. You all right? Martha whispered as they returned to their duties. Fine. You don't look fine. You look like you seen a ghost. Sarah almost laughed. She felt like a ghost walking through the last days of a life that was already over. My brother's being sold, she said quietly. Martha's expression softened. I heard. I'm sorry. It doesn't matter. It always matters. Just because we can't stop it don't mean it doesn't matter. Sarah nodded and moved away before Martha could say anything else. Sympathy was dangerous. It made the walls she had built start to crack. That night, she found Daniel in the stables again. He was repairing a saddle by lamplight, his hands steady on the leather. Hey, he said, smiling when he saw her. Come to visit twice in 1 week? Must be serious. She sat down on a hay bale watching him work. Daniel, I need you to trust me. His hands paused. That sounds ominous. The day after the ball, something's going to happen. I need you to be ready. Ready for what? I can't tell you yet. But when I say run, you run. North. Fast as you can. Don't look back. Daniel set down the saddle and turned to face her fully. Sarah, what are you planning? Do you trust me? Of course, but then trust me now. Promise me you'll do what I say, when I say it. He studied her face in the lamplight. Whatever he saw there made him nod slowly. I promise. Good. Sarah, are you in trouble? She almost laughed again. Yes, the worst trouble possible. But also, for the first time in her life, she was choosing the trouble herself. I'm fine, she lied. Just be ready. She left before he could ask more questions. She couldn't tell him the truth. If he knew, he might try to stop her, or worse, try to help her. And she couldn't bear the thought of him being implicated in what was about to happen. The day before the ball, Mrs. Harrison's anxiety reached a fever pitch. She changed her mind about the flower arrangements 4 times. She sent Lucy to rewash all the windows because she saw a single smudge. She made Bessie remake an entire batch of pastries because they weren't elegant enough. And she drank, more than usual, glass after glass of wine throughout the day, trying to calm her nerves about the upcoming event. Sarah watched carefully, noting Mrs. Harrison's patterns. The woman drank from the same type of glass, a crystal goblet with a distinctive etched pattern. She preferred red wine, specifically a sweet variety from France that the senator kept in the cellar. She would drink steadily throughout an evening like the ball, probably 4 or 5 glasses over several hours. That evening, Sarah volunteered to fetch more wine from the cellar. Thomas gave her a suspicious look but nodded. The ball was tomorrow. They needed all the wine brought up and ready. Sarah descended into the cellar, a cool, dark space that smelled of earth and aged wood. The wine collection took up one entire wall, bottles lying horizontal in wooden racks. She found the section with Mrs. Harrison's preferred wine and selected 3 bottles. This was not the moment. Tomorrow would be the moment. But she needed to understand the space, the timing, the opportunity. She held 1 bottle up to the lamplight. Dark red glass, liquid the color of blood inside. Tomorrow night, one of these bottles would deliver justice. Or murder, depending on who was judging. Sarah carried the bottles upstairs. Bessie was in the kitchen, and when their eyes met, something passed between them. Bessie reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small cloth bundle, no bigger than her palm. "For your headaches," Bessie said loudly, for anyone who might be listening. Then quieter, "All you need. Mix it well. Red wine hides it best." Sarah took the bundle. It was light, almost weightless. Such a small thing to end a life. "Thank you," she whispered. Bessie nodded once, then turned back to her cooking. The conversation was over. They would never speak of it again. Sarah went to her room and hid the bundle in her mattress, pushing it deep into the straw stuffing where no casual search would find it. Then she sat on her bed and stared at her hands. These hands that served and cleaned and obeyed. These hands that would soon kill. She tried to feel guilty, tried to feel afraid, but all she felt was a cold, clear certainty. This was necessary. This was right. Not morally right, perhaps. She wasn't naive enough to think murder could be moral. But necessary. Inevitable. The only power available to her in a system designed to keep her powerless. The last evening before the ball, Garrett made his rounds through the quarters and the house. Sarah heard him talking to Thomas in the hallway outside her room. "Something's not right," Garrett was saying. "Can feel it. Too quiet. Too calm." "You're imagining things," Thomas replied. "Everyone's terrified of making mistakes tomorrow. That's why it's quiet." "Maybe, but I'm keeping extra patrollers out tomorrow night. Anyone tries to run during the confusion of the ball, we'll catch him." "Good. Can't be too careful." They moved away, their voices fading. Sarah lay in the darkness, listening to her own heartbeat. Let them watch the fields. Let them watch the roads. They wouldn't be watching the ballroom. They wouldn't be watching the wine glasses. They wouldn't be watching her. Because she was good. She was obedient. She was trusted. That would be their mistake. The morning of the ball arrived with oppressive heat. The house was in controlled chaos from dawn. Sarah woke before sunrise and retrieved the cloth bundle from her mattress. She tucked it into a small pocket she had sewn into her apron specifically for this purpose. The weight of it against her hip was barely noticeable, but she felt it with every step. Guests would begin arriving at 8 in the evening. The ball would run until past midnight. Sometime in those hours, Mrs. Harrison would die. Sarah went about her morning duties with mechanical precision. She helped Mrs. Harrison dress, did her hair, listened to her nervous chatter about the governor and Charleston society and reputation. None of it seemed real anymore. It was like watching a play where she knew the ending but the actors didn't. In the afternoon, Mrs. Harrison finally dismissed her to rest before the evening's work. "I need you fresh tonight, Sarah. This is the most important event of my life. Don't fail me." "No, ma'am," Sarah said. In her room, Sarah changed into her best servant's dress, plain black with a white apron, freshly starched. She pinned her hair back severely. She looked at herself in the small mirror on her wall. The face that looked back was calm, determined, unrecognizable. She touched the cloth bundle in her pocket one last time. Then she walked toward the main house as the sun began to set. The moment was coming. There was no turning back now. The ballroom blazed with candlelight. 3 crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, each holding dozens of candles that cast flickering shadows across the polished floor. Musicians occupied one corner, their strings creating a genteel backdrop to the murmur of conversation. Tables laden with food lined the walls. Roasted meats, delicate pastries, elaborate desserts that had taken Bessie and her kitchen staff 2 full days to prepare. Sarah moved through the gathering crowd with practiced invisibility. She carried a silver tray with crystal glasses, refilling drinks, removing empty plates, always present but never acknowledged. The guests had begun arriving at 8 o'clock. By 9, the ballroom was filled with South Carolina's elite. Plantation owners, politicians, military officers, their wives adorned in silk and jewels worth more than entire families of enslaved people. Mrs. Harrison stood near the entrance in her emerald gown, greeting each arrival with studied grace. Her cheeks were flushed with excitement and wine. She had already consumed 2 glasses in the hour before guests arrived, trying to steady her nerves. Senator Harrison, who had returned from Washington the previous afternoon, stood beside her in formal evening wear, shaking hands and making political conversation. The atmosphere was one of celebration and absolute confidence. These were people who ruled a world and knew it. Their laughter was easy, their gestures expansive. They spoke of cotton prices and tobacco yields, of political appointments and social scandals, of the weather and their horses and their property, human and otherwise. Sarah listened to fragments of conversation as she moved through the room. Had to sell 3 of them last month. Market strong right now. The important thing is maintaining discipline. Let them think they have any power, and you've lost control. My overseer suggests public whippings work best. The others need to see consequences. A woman in a blue dress laughed at something her companion said. "Oh, I couldn't manage without Sally. She's been with me since I was a girl. I'd be lost without her." She took a sip of champagne. "Though we had to sell her daughter last year. Girl was getting too pretty, if you know what I mean. Caused problems." Sarah's hands tightened on her tray, but her face remained blank. She moved on. At 9:30, Governor Hamilton arrived with his entourage. The musicians paused, and Senator Harrison formally welcomed South Carolina's chief executive. Mrs. Harrison practically glowed with triumph. This was the moment she had been planning for weeks. The validation of her position in Charleston society. Sarah used the distraction of the governor's arrival to slip down to the cellar. She had volunteered to manage the wine service for the evening, and no one questioned her movements. Thomas was too busy supervising the other servants. Bessie was managing constant demands from the kitchen. The other house servants were overwhelmed with their own duties. The cellar was cool and dark. Sarah's hands were steady as she selected a bottle of Mrs. Harrison's preferred wine, the sweet French red. She pulled the cork carefully, setting it aside. From her apron pocket, she withdrew the small cloth bundle Bessie had given her. Inside was a fine powder, gray-green in color. Dried foxglove flowers, ground to dust. 15 flowers worth, Bessie had said. Enough to be certain. Sarah poured the entire contents into the wine bottle. She swirled it gently, watching the powder dissolve into the dark liquid. The motion was hypnotic. This bottle now contained death. Poison mixed with privilege, dissolved in the same vintage that represented everything Mrs. Harrison valued about her position in the world. For a moment, Sarah stood frozen. This was the point of no return. Once she served this wine, there was no taking it back. Mrs. Harrison would die. Sarah would likely be caught. Others might be punished. Daniel might not be saved after all. But then she remembered Mrs. Harrison's casual laughter as she discussed selling Daniel like he was a piece of furniture. She remembered her mother being torn away. She remembered Patience, pregnant and terrified, put on a wagon heading south. She remembered Lucy being sent to the fields for fainting from exhaustion. She remembered every day of her 28 years of being nothing, having nothing, being told she was nothing. Sarah recorked the bottle. She carried it upstairs with 3 other bottles, arranging them on a serving table in a small room adjacent to the ballroom. She placed the poisoned bottle slightly apart from the others and made a small scratch on the label with her fingernail. A mark invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it, but clear enough for her to identify it in dim candlelight. She returned to the ballroom. Mrs. Harrison was in her element now, moving from group to group, laughing and chatting with guests. The governor's wife complimented her gown. A judge praised the excellence of the refreshments. Mrs. Harrison's smile was radiant. Sarah approached with a tray of fresh glasses. "More wine, ma'am." "Yes, thank you, Sarah." Mrs. Harrison took a glass without looking at her. She never looked at her. Sarah moved on, serving other guests, waiting for her moment. The ballroom grew warmer as more people arrived and the candles burned. The music swelled. People began to dance. The evening took on a dreamlike quality. All this elegance and refinement built on a foundation of systematic brutality. At 10:15, Sarah returned to the serving room. She took the poisoned bottle, identified by her small scratch, and carried it carefully back to the ballroom. Mrs. Harrison's glass was empty. Perfect timing. "Ma'am, shall I refill your glass?" Sarah asked, approaching Mrs. Harrison as she stood with a group of plantation owners' wives. "Please," Mrs. Harrison said, extending her glass without interrupting her conversation. She was telling a story about her recent trip to Charleston, some social triumph that the other women seemed to find fascinating. Sarah poured from the poison bottle. The wine looked identical to any other pour, dark red, slightly viscous, catching the candlelight. Mrs. Harrison took the glass and immediately raised it to her lips, taking a long sip without pause in her story. Sarah's heart pounded so hard she thought everyone must hear it. But no one looked at her. She was invisible as always. She moved away, carrying the poisoned bottle to continue serving. She watched from across the room as Mrs. Harrison finished that glass and gestured for another. Sarah returned, poured again from the same bottle. Mrs. Harrison drank deeply, animated by the success of her party. By 11 o'clock, Mrs. Harrison had consumed 3 full glasses from the poisoned bottle. She seemed fine, perhaps slightly more flushed than before, but that could easily be attributed to the warm room and the excitement of the evening. She laughed at the governor's jokes. She danced one song with her husband. She accepted compliments on her hospitality with gracious smiles. Sarah began to doubt. Had the poison been too old? Had Bessie misjudged the dose? Had it somehow failed to mix properly into the wine? Then, at 11:30, Sarah saw Mrs. Harrison touch her chest briefly. A small gesture, barely noticeable. She said something to the woman beside her and fanned herself with her hand. The gesture was casual, easily explained by the heat of the crowded room. But Sarah knew. It was beginning. 10 minutes later, Mrs. Harrison excused herself from a conversation and moved toward the veranda doors. Her steps were slightly uncertain, though only someone watching carefully would notice. Sarah followed at a discreet distance, as was expected of a personal servant. The veranda was cooler, open to the night air. A few other guests stood in small groups, smoking cigars and escaping the heat of the ballroom. Mrs. Harrison walked to the far end, away from the others, and leaned against the railing. Sarah positioned herself a respectful few steps behind. "Fetch me water," Mrs. Harrison said, her voice slightly strained. "Yes, ma'am." Sarah turned to go, but Mrs. Harrison spoke again. "Wait, no, just stay close." Sarah stopped and remained in position, hands folded, watching Mrs. Harrison's back. The woman's shoulders were rising and falling with her breathing, the motion too rapid, too shallow. A minute passed. Mrs. Harrison gripped the railing tighter. "I don't feel well," she said, more to herself than to Sarah. The heat, too much excitement. Another minute. Mrs. Harrison's breathing became audibly labored. She turned to look at Sarah, and for the first time in years, she really looked at her, saw her as a person, not a piece of furniture. "Something's wrong," Mrs. Harrison said. Her eyes were frightened. "Sarah, something's wrong. Fetch my husband. Now." Sarah hesitated for exactly 1 second. It was a second too long. Mrs. Harrison's expression changed. The fear in her eyes deepened, but something else joined it. Understanding. Horrible, dawning understanding. "You," Mrs. Harrison whispered. "You did something. What did you?" Her knees buckled. Sarah stepped forward and caught her, lowering her to a bench against the wall. Mrs. Harrison's breathing was rapid and ragged now, her lips taking on a bluish tint in the candlelight from the ballroom. "What did you do?" Mrs. Harrison gasped, her fingers digging into Sarah's wrist. "What did you give me?" Sarah said nothing. Her face was calm, almost serene. She met Mrs. Harrison's terrified eyes without flinching. "You poisoned me," Mrs. Harrison whispered. You murdered me. Why? I treated you well. I kept you in the house. I trusted you." Still Sarah said nothing. "Help?" Mrs. Harrison tried to call out, but her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. Her grip on Sarah's wrist weakened. "Help me, please. I'll free you. I'll free your brother. Please." "You were going to sell Daniel," Sarah said quietly. Her voice was steady, without emotion. "My brother. The only family I have. You were going to sell him for $800 to pay your husband's gambling debts." Mrs. Harrison's eyes widened. She tried to speak but couldn't form words. Her hand fell away from Sarah's wrist. "You sold my mother," Sarah continued in that same quiet, steady voice. "You sold patience. You were going to sell Daniel. You treat people like property, like things, so I took the thing you valued most. Your life." "Senator Harrison." The voice came from inside the ballroom, loud and alarmed. Someone had noticed Mrs. Harrison's absence and was calling for the senator. Sarah stood and stepped back from the bench. Mrs. Harrison lay gasping, one hand pressed to her chest, unable to call out, unable to move, unable to do anything but stare at Sarah with accusing, terrified eyes. Senator Harrison burst through the veranda doors, followed by several guests. He saw his wife collapsed on the bench and rushed to her side. "Amelia, what happened?" "She said she felt ill," Sarah said, her voice perfectly composed. She came out for air and collapsed. I was about to call for help. The senator didn't question her. Why would he? Sarah was trusted. Sarah was obedient. Sarah was good. A doctor who had been attending the ball pushed through the gathering crowd. He knelt beside Mrs. Harrison and checked her pulse, her breathing, her coloring. His face grew grave. Her heartbeat is extremely irregular, weak and rapid. We need to get her inside to her bedroom. Now. Four men lifted Mrs. Harrison and carried her inside. The ballroom, moments ago filled with music and laughter, descended into shocked whispers. Guests stepped back, creating a path as Mrs. Harrison was carried through. Her head lolled to one side, her eyes half closed, her breathing labored and rattling. Sarah followed as they carried her upstairs to the master bedroom. She had been ordered to attend her mistress, a cruel irony she noted with detached observation. The bedroom filled with people. The doctor, Senator Harrison, the governor, several concerned guests who pushed their way in. Mrs. Harrison was laid on the bed. The doctor loosened her dress, felt her pulse again, listened to her chest. He looked up at the senator with a grim expression. Her heart is failing. I don't know why. Did she have any history of heart problems? No. Never. She was perfectly healthy. The senator turned to Sarah, who stood in the corner. What did she eat tonight? What did she drink? Sarah provided a detailed list, her voice steady. Wine, champagne, small portions of the food from the tables. Nothing unusual. Several glasses of her preferred French red wine throughout the evening. Could it be the wine? Someone suggested. Test it, the senator ordered. Bring me the bottles she drank from. Sarah's stomach tightened, but her expression didn't change. The bottles were brought, including the poisoned one, which still had wine in it. The doctor examined them, smelled them, even tasted a small sip from one. They seem fine to me, he said, though I'm not an expert in poisons. Poisons? The senator's voice rose. You think she was poisoned? I don't know what else could cause such sudden heart failure in a healthy woman. The doctor looked around the room. Has she had any conflicts with anyone? Any enemies? Garrett the overseer pushed into the room at that moment, summoned by one of the guests. He took in the scene quickly. Mrs. Harrison dying, the doctor, the crowd of concerned aristocrats. This ain't natural, Garrett said bluntly. Someone did this. All eyes turned to the servants present in the room. Sarah stood alone in her corner, hands folded, face blank. Thomas the butler stood near the door. Two other house servants waited in the hallway. Check the servants' quarters, Senator Harrison ordered. Search everything. Someone here knows what happened. Garrett grabbed Sarah's arm. His grip was bruising. You've been acting strange. You've been asking about poisons. You're coming with me. Sarah allowed herself to be dragged from the room. As she was pulled through the doorway, she heard Mrs. Harrison take a rattling, gasping breath. Then another. Then nothing. She's gone, the doctor said quietly. I'm sorry. She's gone. The words followed Sarah down the hallway as Garrett pulled her toward the overseer's quarters. Mrs. Harrison was dead. The poison had worked. There was no going back now. The rest of the night would be interrogation, pain, and truth. But for one moment, Sarah felt something close to satisfaction. She had done it. She had taken something back. She had made them see her, even if only in death. She had chosen her own ending. Garrett threw Sarah into a chair in the overseer's quarters. The small building was separate from the main house, designed for privacy during interrogations and punishments. Thomas limped in behind them, his face twisted with anger. Two other overseers entered. both armed with whips coiled at their belts. A single oil lamp cast harsh shadows on the walls. Senator Harrison arrived moments later, his face white with shock and red with rage. His wife had been dead less than 10 minutes. The ball guests were being ushered out, the evening ending in scandal and horror instead of social triumph. "What did you give her?" The senator's voice was low and dangerous. "Nothing, sir. I only served what I was instructed to serve. Thomas says you've been asking about poisons, about herbs. I asked Bessie about remedies for headaches, sir. That's all." Garrett stepped forward and struck her across the face. The blow snapped her head to the side, splitting her lip. Blood filled her mouth. "Don't lie to us, girl. Your mistress is dead. Someone killed her. You're the one who served her all night." Sarah said nothing. She kept her eyes down, her body still, absorbing the violence as she had learned to do years ago. "Search her quarters," Senator Harrison ordered. "Search the kitchen. Search everywhere she had access to. Find the poison." 2 overseers left immediately. Sarah heard them moving through the house, opening doors, pulling apart rooms. They would find nothing. She had burned the cloth bundle in the kitchen fire hours ago, watched it curl and blacken and disappear. The poisoned wine bottle was already disposed of by other servants cleaning up after the ball, mixed in with dozens of other empty bottles. "While we wait," Garrett said, "maybe we can encourage her to talk." He pulled a short leather strap from his belt, one designed specifically for close quarters beatings. Sarah knew what was coming. She had seen this violence inflicted on others. Now it was her turn. The first blow caught her across the shoulders. The second split the skin on her back. She bit down on her bleeding lip but made no sound. Giving them her pain felt like giving them power, and she had so little left to hold on to. "Tell us what you did." Garrett punctuated each word with another strike. Sarah's vision swam with pain, but she kept silent. Blood soaked through her dress. Her back was on fire, but she had decided weeks ago that she would not break. They could have her body, they could have her life, but they would not have her voice unless she chose to give it. Thomas watched from the corner, his expression unreadable. The senator stood with his arms crossed, letting the overseer work. After a dozen blows, Garrett stopped, breathing hard. "She's stubborn. Bessie might be easier." "Bring her," the senator ordered. 10 minutes later, they dragged Bessie into the overseer's quarters. The old woman was terrified, her eyes wide. She looked at Sarah, beaten and bloody in the chair, and something passed between them. "Did you give this girl poison?" Senator Harrison demanded. "Did you help her kill my wife?" "No, sir, I swear it. I just told her about healing plants. I didn't give her nothing." "You're lying. Both of you are lying." Garrett moved toward Bessie with the leather strap. The old woman's face crumpled with fear. She had survived this long by being useful, by staying invisible, by causing no trouble. Now she was about to be beaten, maybe killed, for someone else's choice. Sarah couldn't let that happen. "Stop," Sarah said clearly. "Leave her alone." The room went silent. Everyone turned to look at her. "She had nothing to do with it," Sarah continued. "It was only me." Senator Harrison stepped close, his face inches from hers. "What did you say?" "I poisoned her. I put foxglove in her wine. I killed your wife." Bessie knew nothing about it. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Bessie made a small, wounded sound. Thomas's mouth fell open. Garrett lowered his strap, shocked into stillness. Senator Harrison stared at her for a long moment. "You're confessing? You murdered my wife." "Yes." "Why?" His voice cracked on the word. "We treated you well. We kept you in the house. We fed you, clothed you. Why would you do this?" Sarah met his eyes directly for the first time in her life. You were going to sell Daniel, my brother, the only family I have left. So you killed her? Over a stable boy. She sold my mother when I was 12. She sold Patience when she was pregnant with your nephew's child. She was going to sell Daniel like he was a piece of furniture. For $800 to cover your gambling debts. Sarah's voice was steady, clear, without apology. She took everything from me, so I took what she loved most. The senator's face went from white to dark red. His hand shot out and grabbed Sarah's throat, squeezing. You're an animal, a savage. We should have never brought your kind into our homes. Never trusted you. Never. You trusted me because I was useful. Sarah gasped against his grip. Because I was obedient. Because you thought you had broken me completely. The senator released her throat. She coughed, then continued. But you can't break what you never saw as human in the first place. Garrett grabbed her hair and yanked her head back. Watch your mouth, girl. You're gonna hang for this. But first we're gonna make you hurt. I've been hurting my whole life, Sarah said. You just never noticed. The door burst open and Marcus pushed inside, held back by two overseers. What's happening? I heard. He saw Sarah, beaten and bleeding, and his face went hard. What did she do? She murdered Mrs. Harrison, Thomas said, his voice shaking. Poisoned her at the ball. Marcus's eyes met Sarah's. She saw understanding there and something like pride. He had told her weeks ago that she should let him know when she was brave enough. Now he knew. Get him out of here, the senator ordered. Lock down the entire plantation. No one leaves. Every slave is to be gathered in front of the main house at dawn. They will all watch what happens to murderers. Daniel was brought in next, dragged from the stables by two overseers. He was confused, frightened, still unaware of what had happened. When he saw Sarah, he broke free and ran to her. Sarah, what's going on? What did you do? She looked at her brother. His face so like their mother's, his eyes full of fear and confusion. I saved you. They were going to sell you, day after tomorrow, to Mississippi. Daniel's face crumpled with understanding and horror. No, you didn't. Sarah, tell me you didn't. I did. Why? You didn't have to do this. We could have run. We could have. You would have been caught, killed. This way, at least you stay here. She tried to smile, but her split lip made it impossible. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I couldn't think of a better way. Daniel collapsed to his knees, sobbing. The overseers let him stay there. Even they were moved by the sight of a boy realizing his sister had committed murder to save him. Senator Harrison watched the scene with cold fury. Take her to the cellar. Chain her. At dawn we build the gallows. Every slave on this plantation will watch her hang. And to ensure this never happens again. He turned to Garrett. 10 lashes for every house servant. 20 for the field hands. They all knew something was wrong. They all stayed silent. They're all guilty. Sarah's satisfaction turned to horror. They knew nothing. This was only me. Don't punish them. Shut your mouth. You don't get to speak anymore. You're already dead. Garrett and another overseer dragged her from the room. Behind her, she heard Daniel's continued sobbing and Bessie's whispered prayers. They pulled her to the cellar beneath the main house and chained her wrists to an iron ring set into the stone wall. The chains were short, forcing her to sit with her arms raised above her head. Then they left her in darkness. Sarah could hear sounds from above. Footsteps, shouted orders, the beginning of the collective punishment. The crack of whips, screams. She had saved Daniel but brought suffering on dozens of others. The system's response to individual resistance was overwhelming, indiscriminate violence. She sat in the dark and listened to people being beaten because of her choice. The screams went on for hours. Lucy, Martha, others whose voices she recognized. Field hands she barely knew, being punished for a crime they hadn't committed, hadn't even known about. This was the cost of resistance. Not just her own life, but pain inflicted on her community. The system made sure of that. Made sure that fighting back always hurt more people than the person who fought. Around 3 in the morning, the sounds finally stopped. Sarah's arms were numb from being raised, her back on fire from Garrett's beating. Blood had dried on her dress. She drifted in and out of consciousness. A key turned in the cellar door. Sarah expected another beating, another interrogation. Instead, Bessie came down the stairs carrying a cup of water. An overseer stood guard at the top, but he let the old woman approach. Bessie knelt by Sarah and held the cup to her lips. Sarah drank gratefully, the water stinging her split lip but soothing her throat. "They beat you?" Sarah asked. 10 lashes. I'll survive. Been through worse." Bessie's eyes were sad and knowing. "You knew this would happen. You knew they'd punish everyone. I didn't want. I know. But the system don't care what you want. It just crushes and crushes until there's nothing left." Bessie adjusted Sarah's position slightly, trying to ease the strain on her arms. "But you did something they'll remember. You showed them they can't make us into nothing. That we can still choose, still fight back, even if it costs everything. Was it worth it? That ain't for me to say. But your brother's still here. The sale's canceled. Senator told Garrett this morning that no one wants to buy the poisoner's brother. So Daniel stays. You saved him." Sarah closed her eyes. Daniel was safe. That would have to be enough. "You're brave," Bessie whispered. "Braver than I ever was. Braver than most. People will remember this. Your name won't be forgotten. My name doesn't matter. It does. It will. You watch." Bessie stood with difficulty, her back stiff from her own beating. "I got to go. They're only letting me bring you water because you need to be alive for the hanging." "Bessie, thank you. For everything." The old woman nodded once, tears in her eyes, then climbed back up the stairs. The door closed. Darkness returned. Near dawn, Marcus bribed the guard with money he had somehow acquired. He came down to the cellar and knelt by the door, as close as the guard would allow him to get. "Sarah," he whispered, "some of us are planning to run. Tonight, after they hang you, your death won't be for nothing. We're going north. Don't get caught. Please, make it count if you go. We will, and we'll tell people what you did, why you did it. Your story won't die here. Just run far. Run fast. Be free. We will. Because of you. Because you showed us it's possible to fight." He paused. "They're building the gallows now, in front of the main house. Sun's almost up." Sarah nodded. She had known this was how it would end. She had chosen this. Marcus left. Sarah sat alone in the darkness, listening to the sounds of construction above. The gallows being built, her death being prepared. She thought about her mother sold away screaming. She thought about Patience and all the others. She thought about Daniel still here because of her choice. She thought about every day of her 28 years, every moment of forced submission, every swallowed word, every silent scream. She had been born a slave, but she would die having chosen something, having done something, having mattered. That would have to be enough. At dawn, Garrett came for her. He unlocked the chains and pulled her to her feet. Her legs barely worked after hours sitting, and she stumbled. He dragged her up the cellar stairs, through the house, now silent and empty after last night's horror, and out the front door. The sun was just rising, painting the sky pink and gold. A beautiful morning for a murder. The gallows stood in front of the main house, hastily built but solid.
O plattform, o bom, o rop.
Simple tools for ending a life. Every enslaved person on the plantation had been forced to gather. 60 field hands, 8 house servants, all arranged in rows with overseers positioned to prevent anyone from running. Their faces showed fear, exhaustion from last night's beatings, and something else. In some faces, anger. In others, hidden admiration. In Daniel's face, visible in the front row, devastation. The senator's house guests who had stayed overnight gathered on the veranda, watching with fascinated horror. A preacher stood near the gallows, ready to condemn Sarah's soul to hell. Garrett dragged her up the steps to the platform. Sarah's legs found strength she didn't know she had left. She would not stumble. She would not fall. She would walk to her death with dignity. The noose was thick rope, rough against her neck as they placed it. Sarah looked out at the crowd. At Daniel, held back by 2 overseers, tears streaming down his face. At Bessie, standing with the other house servants, her expression proud and grieving. At Marcus, his jaw set with determination. Thomas, looking away, unable to watch. At the field hands, some scared, some angry, some seeing her as a fool, others as a martyr. The preacher began to speak about sin and punishment and hell. Sarah stopped listening. She didn't need his absolution or his condemnation. Any last words? Garrett asked, his hand on the lever that would drop the platform. Sarah looked at Senator Harrison standing on the veranda, his face twisted with hatred and grief. She looked at the other plantation owners, the elite of Charleston society, the people who built their wealth on the broken backs of people they refused to see as human. "I am not sorry," Sarah said clearly. Her voice carried across the yard. "She was going to sell my brother. She sold my mother. She sold others. You treat us like property, like things without souls or families or hearts. So I took from her what she took from so many of us. I am not sorry. Hang the murderous bitch," the senator said coldly. Garrett pulled the lever. The platform dropped. Sarah fell. The rope caught, but it didn't break her neck cleanly as a properly constructed gallows would have. Instead, she hung there choking, dying slowly. Took 3 minutes. 3 minutes of struggling, of gasping, of slowly fading. Daniel screamed her name. Marcus had to hold him back from rushing the gallows. Bessie prayed. The crowd watched in enforced silence. When it was finally over, when Sarah's body hung still and lifeless, the overseers cut her down and carried her away.
No ceremony, no marker.
Just a body to be disposed of. The enslaved population was forced to stand there for another hour, looking at the empty gallows, understanding the message. This is what happens to those who resist. This is what happens to those who fight back. Then they were sent back to work. The fields didn't care about death. The tobacco still needed harvesting. Life on the plantation continued as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, and those who witnessed it would remember. Sarah's body was buried in the woods beyond the fields, in an unmarked grave dug by 2 field hands under overseer supervision.
No funeral, no prayer, no marker.
Senator Harrison wanted her erased from memory, as if forgetting her would undo what she had done. But memory is not so easily controlled. The days following the execution were heavy with enforced silence. House servants moved like ghosts, afraid to speak or make eye contact. Field hands worked with heads down, the memory of the hanging fresh in their minds. The punishment beatings had left everyone sore and exhausted. The message was clear. Resistance brings overwhelming violence not just on the resistor but on everyone. Yet in this silence, something unexpected grew. Late at night, in the slave quarters, people began to whisper Sarah's name. Bessie, despite her own fear, told the younger servants what Sarah had done and why. She spoke of a woman who refused to accept the theft of her last family member, who chose action over submission even knowing the cost. Marcus told Field Hands about Sarah's last words from the gallows. "I am not sorry." Those 4 words circulated through the quarters like a secret scripture. Some repeated them in wonder, others in horror, but everyone remembered them. Daniel, despite his devastating grief, found himself sharing his sister's story with other enslaved people he encountered. He talked about how she had saved him from being sold to Mississippi, how she had loved him enough to die for him, how she had refused to accept the powerlessness they had all been taught was their only option. The story spread beyond the Harrison plantation through the underground networks of communication between enslaved people. Traveling preachers carried it. Free black people whispered it in Charleston. Those who escaped north took it with them, adding it to the collection of resistance stories that sustained hope in impossible circumstances. But the interpretation of Sarah's actions was far from uniform. Among the enslaved population, opinions split. Some viewed Sarah as a martyr, a hero who had struck back against impossible odds. Her willingness to die rather than accept further losses made her, in their eyes, someone who had reclaimed her humanity through decisive action. Others saw her as reckless and selfish. The collective punishment she had triggered, the beatings, the increased surveillance, the atmosphere of terror, had hurt people who had nothing to do with her choice. Lucy, the young house girl, now bore 20 scars on her back because Sarah had poisoned Mrs. Harrison. Was that justice? Was that worth it? Thomas the butler publicly condemned Sarah as evil, calling her a murderer and a betrayer of the trust that had been placed in house servants. But privately, late at night, he found himself troubled. He had devoted his life to loyalty and obedience after his own beating years ago. He had believed survival required total submission. Sarah had shown that submission could coexist with planning, with strategy, with the possibility of action. This thought disturbed him more than he could articulate. Bessie felt a complex mixture of guilt and pride. Guilt for providing the poison, for enabling Sarah's choice, for the beatings that followed. But also pride that someone had finally struck back, had refused to be nothing, had made the masters see that their absolute power had cracks. Marcus and several other field hands, emboldened by Sarah's example, escaped 3 weeks after her execution. They took advantage of confusion during a storm and ran north. 2 were caught and killed by patrollers, but Marcus and 2 others made it to free territory. Years later, Marcus would tell Sarah's story to abolitionists, who would write it down, preserving her name in the historical record. Senator Harrison's response to his wife's death was paranoid and cruel. He sold several house servants, fearing they might follow Sarah's example. He hired additional overseers and implemented harsher punishments for minor infractions. He installed new locks throughout the house. He stopped eating meals prepared entirely by enslaved hands, insisting a white cook be hired to supervise. But his fear was visible to everyone. He no longer felt safe in his own home. The illusion of absolute control had been shattered by one quiet woman with foxglove powder. He spent less and less time at the plantation, staying in Washington for months at a stretch. When he did return, he was jumpy, suspicious, seeing threats in every corner. The plantation, once a showpiece of Carolina elegance, took on a darker atmosphere. The increased violence and surveillance made everyone tense. Productivity actually decreased as fear replaced the previous system of calculated intimidation. Within 2 years, Senator Harrison would sell the plantation entirely and move to Charleston permanently. He never remarried. Daniel remained on the plantation for 2 more years. The sale to Mississippi had been quietly canceled, No one wanted to buy the poisoner's brother, and the scandal made any transaction complicated. But Daniel was watched constantly, suspected of harboring his sister's rebellious spirit. He became withdrawn, haunted by survivor's guilt. He had nightmares about the hanging, seeing Sarah's face in his dreams. He visited her unmarked grave regularly when he could slip away unnoticed, leaving small stones as markers. In 1833, 2 years after Sarah's death, Daniel attempted escape. He made it 30 miles before patrollers caught him. They shot him during the pursuit. He died on the road north, but not before telling Sarah's story to 2 other runaways he had met at a safe house. Those men made it to freedom and carried the story with them. The legal and social fallout from Sarah's act spread far beyond the Harrison plantation. News of the poisoning traveled through Charleston society like wildfire. The Charleston Courier ran a headline, "Treacherous House Slave Poisons Senator's Wife at Ball, Hanged for Murder." The article portrayed Sarah as a monster, an example of the dangers of being too lenient with enslaved people, proof that they could never truly be trusted no matter how well treated. The story was picked up by newspapers across the South. It became a cautionary tale used to justify harsher slave codes. South Carolina passed new legislation restricting the movement of enslaved people, prohibiting them from learning to read or write, and increasing penalties for anyone caught teaching them. Other southern states followed suit. Plantation owners held meetings to discuss security measures. They shared strategies for preventing similar incidents, never allowing enslaved people access to poisons or medicines, rotating house servants frequently to prevent them from becoming too comfortable or trusted, increasing surveillance, and implementing swift collective punishment for any hint of resistance. Ironically, Sarah's act, meant to strike back at her individual oppressor, was used to tighten the system's grip on thousands of others. This was the system's genius. It could absorb individual acts of resistance and transform them into justification for greater oppression. Yet a counter-narrative circulated simultaneously, invisible to white society but alive in enslaved communities. While newspapers condemned Sarah, another story spread through quarters, in whispered conversations, in coded songs, through the networks that connected enslaved people across plantations and states. In this version, Sarah was not a monster but a woman pushed beyond endurance. She was a mother figure who protected her brother. She was someone who refused to accept the unacceptable. She was brave. She was strong. She was someone who chose death with dignity over life without it. Traveling preachers, both enslaved and free black clergy, carried her story. They didn't celebrate murder. Many struggled with the moral complexity, but they acknowledged the impossible position she had faced. They asked their congregations, "What would you do if your last family member was about to be torn away? If you had no legal recourse, no protection, no hope of justice, what would you do?" The story became part of the oral tradition that sustained enslaved communities. It joined other stories of resistance: Nat Turner's rebellion, Denmark Vesey's planned uprising, individual acts of sabotage and refusal. These stories served a purpose. They reminded people that resistance was possible, that submission was not inevitable, that even in the most oppressive systems, individuals could choose to fight back. But Sarah's story also served as a cautionary tale within these communities. It showed the brutal costs of resistance. It showed how the system punished not just the individual but everyone connected to them. It raised questions about strategy, about when violence was justified, about whether individual acts of revenge served the cause of freedom or simply brought more suffering. Years passed. The Civil War came and went. Slavery ended, at least in legal terms. The Harrison plantation was burned during Sherman's march through South Carolina. The grand house where Sarah had served, where she had been beaten, where the midnight ball had taken place, all of it turned to ash. But people remembered. After emancipation, Bessie, who survived to see freedom, was interviewed by a researcher documenting formerly enslaved people's testimonies. She was 73 by then, nearly blind, but her memory was sharp. She told Sarah's story in full detail, providing one of the few documented accounts. She wasn't evil, Bessie told the researcher. A white woman from Boston. She was desperate, and desperate people do desperate things. That system made her desperate. That system made all of us desperate every day of our lives. Sarah just decided she wouldn't die desperate and powerless. She'd die having chosen something. The researcher asked if Bessie thought the murder was justified. Justified? Bessie laughed. A dry sound. You asking the wrong question. That word don't mean nothing in a system where every day is injustice. Where a woman can sell your child for pocket change. Where your body, your family, your whole life don't belong to you. You asking me, was it justified for Sarah to kill someone who was going to tear her family apart? I'm asking you, was it justified for that woman to have the power to tear families apart in the first place? The researcher included Bessie's testimony in her book, published in 1872. The book sold poorly and was largely forgotten, but it preserved Sarah's name and story for future generations. For decades after the war, Sarah's grave remained unmarked and unknown to anyone outside the former enslaved community from the Harrison plantation. But those who knew, the children of those who had witnessed the hanging, the grandchildren who heard the stories, they remembered the approximate location. In 1891, 60 years after Sarah's execution, Daniel's descendants, through cousins, Daniel's own escape attempt had ended in death, returned to the site of the old plantation. The grand house was gone, just charred ruins overgrown with vegetation. But they found the woods where Sarah had been buried. They placed a marker, simple stone, carved with basic letters. Sarah, born 1803, died 1831. She chose freedom. The words were carefully selected. Not she was freed or she found freedom, but she chose freedom, because that's what she had done, in the only way available to her. Sarah's story, while extraordinary in its documentation, echoed countless other acts of resistance that were never recorded. Historians estimate that poisoning was one of the most common forms of resistance among enslaved people, particularly among those who worked in plantation houses and had access to food preparation. Most cases were never documented, either because they were successfully attributed to natural causes or because authorities suppressed the information to avoid encouraging similar acts. Sarah's case is unusual primarily because it was so public, occurring at a ball with the governor present, involving a senator's wife, and because authorities wanted to use it as a deterrent. They documented it extensively to make an example of her. Ironically, this documentation is what preserved her story. But the moral questions Sarah's story raises remain unresolved and deeply uncomfortable. Was her action justified? She killed a woman. Mrs. Harrison, for all her cruelty and casual destruction of families, was also a product of her system. She had been raised to see enslaved people as property, taught that this was natural and right, rewarded for maintaining the system. She was not an architect of slavery but a participant in it. Does that make her a legitimate target for lethal resistance? On the other hand, Mrs. Harrison was not innocent. She actively chose to sell people, including Sarah's mother and brother. She had the power to make different choices and chose cruelty. She benefited materially and socially from the oppression of others. In a system where enslaved people had no legal recourse, no protection, no rights, was violence against their oppressors a form of self-defense? Sarah had no way to save her brother except through Mrs. Harrison's death. The legal system offered her nothing. Begging would have been useless. She knew from experience that pleas for mercy fell on deaf ears. Running would have resulted in Daniel's death and likely her own. In that context, was killing Mrs. Harrison her only viable option? But what about the collective punishment that followed? Sarah's act brought beatings and suffering upon dozens of people who had nothing to do with her choice. Lucy was whipped because Sarah poisoned Mrs. Harrison. Field hands who barely knew Sarah bore scars because of her action. Is an individual's resistance worth the community's suffering? Yet the system itself created this dilemma. The collective punishment was not Sarah's choice. It was the system's response, deliberately designed to make resistance seem too costly. By blaming Sarah for the system's retaliation, aren't we accepting the system's framing? Shouldn't the blame rest with those who chose to beat innocent people rather than with the person who fought back against her own oppression? These questions have no comfortable answers. They force us to confront the reality that in deeply unjust systems, all choices available to the oppressed are terrible. Sarah could submit and watch her brother be sold, carrying that grief for the rest of her life. She could do nothing and remain good in the eyes of her oppressors while dying inside. Or she could fight back, knowing it would cost her life and potentially harm others. She chose to fight. Was that heroic or selfish? Brave or reckless? Just or murderous? Perhaps it was all of these things simultaneously. Perhaps moral clarity is a luxury available only to those who have never faced impossible choices. Modern audiences grapple with Sarah's story differently than her contemporaries did. Some see her as a hero who refused to accept her dehumanization, who fought back against impossible odds, who died with dignity rather than live in submission. Others see her as a murderer who took an innocent life and brought suffering on her community, whose personal revenge was not worth the collective cost. Both perspectives hold truth. And that's what makes the story morally complex and historically important. It refuses easy categorization. It forces uncomfortable questions about violence, resistance, oppression, and the nature of justice in unjust systems. The system of slavery was designed specifically to prevent what Sarah did. Public executions, collective punishment, overwhelming retaliation. All of these tactics were meant to make resistance seem futile and too costly. The system relied on enslaved people internalizing their powerlessness, accepting that fighting back was impossible or wrong. Yet resistance continued. In ways large and small, enslaved people fought back every day. They broke tools. They worked slowly. They sabotaged crops. They ran away. They poisoned their oppressors. They rebelled. The system never achieved the total control it sought because human beings, even in the most oppressive circumstances, find ways to assert their humanity and resist their dehumanization. Sarah's story is one small example of a much larger pattern of resistance that existed throughout slavery's history. From the slave ships where captured Africans jumped overboard rather than accept enslavement, to the rebellions that terrified plantation owners, to the thousands of individual acts of sabotage and refusal, the system was constantly contested from within. The question is not whether resistance existed, it clearly did. The question is whether it was effective, whether it was morally justified, and what we should learn from it. Sarah's resistance was not effective in changing the system. Slavery continued for 30 more years after her death. Her action didn't free anyone except, arguably, her brother, and he died trying to escape 2 years later. The immediate result of her resistance was her own death and suffering for her community. Yet her story survived. It inspired some people and terrified others. It showed that even in a system designed to crush all resistance, individuals could still choose to fight back. Perhaps that's a kind of effectiveness, not changing the system in her lifetime, but planting seeds of resistance that would eventually contribute to the system's collapse. The moral justification remains contested. Was she right to kill? Philosophers and ethicists have debated this for generations, applying theories of just war, self-defense, revolution, and individual rights. Some argue she had a right to defend herself and her family by any means necessary in a system that denied her all legal rights. Others argue that murder cannot be justified regardless of circumstances, that two wrongs don't make a right. But these philosophical debates often feel disconnected from the lived reality of Sarah's situation. She was not in a philosophy seminar weighing ethical theories. She was a woman with no rights, no protection, no legal recourse, watching her last family member about to be torn away. In that moment, she made a choice. Whether we judge that choice as right or wrong says as much about our own moral frameworks as it does about her actions. What should we learn from Sarah's story? Perhaps this: that systems of oppression force people into impossible positions where all choices are terrible. That individual acts of resistance, while morally complex, reflect the fundamental human need to assert one's own humanity against systems designed to deny it. That the costs of resistance are always high, but the costs of submission are also high in ways less visible but no less real. We should also learn about the mechanics of oppression, how the system responded to Sarah's resistance with overwhelming collective punishment, how it used her story as propaganda to justify even harsher controls, how it framed individual resistance as evidence that enslaved people needed more supervision rather than as evidence that the system itself was unjust. And we should learn about memory and erasure. Senator Harrison tried to erase Sarah. Unmarked grave, no marker, no name. But her story survived because people in her community refused to let her be forgotten. They whispered her name. They told her story. They passed it down through generations. Memory became a form of resistance itself, a way of saying, this person mattered, this injustice happened, this story will not be forgotten. Sarah's story resonates today in discussions about when violence against oppression is justified, how systems maintain control through collective punishment, the costs of resistance both personal and communal, how history is written by those in power, and how marginalized people preserve their own histories against erasure. Her story doesn't provide easy answers. Instead, it forces us to sit with uncomfortable questions and moral complexity. It asks us to consider, what would you do in her position? With no rights, no protection, no hope of justice through legal means, facing the loss of your only remaining family member. What would you do? Would you have remained silent and obedient, hoping for mercy that would never come? Would you have accepted that Daniel would be sold, that you would lose your last family member, and try to survive that grief as you had survived previous losses? Or would you have done what Sarah did, knowing it would cost your life and possibly bring punishment on others, but refusing to accept your powerlessness without a fight? There is no comfortable answer, and that's precisely the point. The final image, years after all the principals in this story are dead. A small stone marker in overgrown woods where a grand plantation once stood. The house is gone, burned during war. The fields are returning to forest. The system that killed Sarah is destroyed, though its echoes persist in new forms. But the marker remains. Sarah, born 1803, died 1831. She chose freedom. Moss grows on the stone. Trees shade it. Few people know it's there. But it stands as testimony to one woman's refusal to accept her powerlessness. Her choice to act, regardless of consequences. Her determination to be seen, to matter, to leave a mark on a world that tried to erase her. Her story, buried, suppressed, but never fully erased, survives. And in surviving, it asks each generation the same uncomfortable questions about power, resistance, justice, and the price of freedom. Some stories provide comfort. Sarah's story provides questions. And sometimes questions are more valuable than answers.